Namibia has recently enacted the Access to Information Law, Act 8 of 2022, which has the potential to solidify freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and the protection of human rights to an unprecedented extent. In collaboration with the Namibia Media Trust, NMT, the Editors Forum of Namibia, EFN, successfully organized a 5-day training workshop for various organizations that champion media freedom, pluralism, independence, and self-regulation. The workshop aimed to position itself in a way that ensures journalists and senior editorial managers in Namibia are well informed about such legislation. The attributes associated with freedom of expression and freedom of the media, such as a robust democracy, transparency, accountability, and the rule of law, are all beneficial for businesses and stem from an informed society. The workshop, facilitated by Professor Justine Limpitlaw, an associate professor at Wits University in South Africa, featured insights from Skopje investigative journalist Pauli Van Wyk, who shared their experience on how similar laws have empowered fearless journalism in her country. Federico Links, the chairperson of Action Coalition, also provided background on the journey of Namibia's ATI law from policy to act. In addition to the training workshop, Professor Justine Limpitlaw participated in a roundtable discussion addressing questions raised by some of the participants.
Justine, just at the one slide of the access exemption for information without authorization component that our ATI speaks of, my thought process immediately jumped in 3 directions, because mention was made of the freedom of expression component, because just in order to help me understand how the freedom of expression ultimately is flows up into how the commissioners and the deputy commissioner will have to act. And then the second question, ultimately part 2, is how does it actually flow or impact Namibia's continuation of the data protection policy? Because obviously that data protection is information for that matter. And my understanding so far has been that I see things develop disjointedly in various partitions, but they actually speak to the same overall concern. Just how do those 2 specifics function? And then ultimately, the access exemption authorization thing, does it actually also flow into the disclosure of assets that MPs and ministers have to provide? Like in our case in Namibia, it is a report or something that you can actually pull from the website. Do you understand their worth, their assets, and who they are in society?
The issue that Dwight is highlighting for us is the fact that there's one of the offences is to have access to exempted information. We're not supposed to have access. Now, one can interpret that in a number of ways. Do you actively go and seek that access? Do you, for example, break into an office or pick up documents that you're not supposed to have? And how is this going to be interpreted by the courts? I think it would be enormously dangerous and damaging. And indeed, this has been argued in our courts in South Africa really recently, where a whistleblower gives information to the press. Now, the whistleblower might have taken that information. The whistleblower might herself or himself have access to that information via their job. But what they've done is to put that in an envelope and leave it at a media house, or, and this often happens, leave it at an NGO or civil society organization that works in that field, that the whistleblower feels is trusted to act in the public interest. In my view, it would be utterly invidious for the courts to say, no, not only can you not publish, but just being in possession of this when you've done nothing wrong, it's been given to you in the public interest, for them to then hold the media or the journalist, the newspaper or radio station, whatever, liable for access to that when through no fault of their own they have access, I think would be invidious. And I just want to say why I think it's important about freedom of expression. It is not a crime to practice journalism. It is not a crime to inform the public about information that you have that is in the public interest. And for this provision to be interpreted as criminalizing journalism would make a mockery of what the entire Access to Information Act is all about. So I can't see a court interpreting that provision in that way, but it is ambiguous, and I think that's a danger. And ultimately, certainly in South Africa, we've seen numerous amendments to the our PIA Act, our Access to Information Act. You're going to have some amendments in due course. Make sure that that is clarified so that journalists and other people, not just journalists, civil society, people that act in the public interest, are also protected from that. It's a totally different thing if that information, for example, is given to a foreign intelligence agent, where everyone's mind is focused on, the crime of espionage. That's a totally different situation to a whistleblower giving information to the media that then publishes that and handles that information and publishes that. You cannot treat those things as the same. They are not the same.
Is there a convolution that might take place there? Sort of like blurring the lines.
Yes, I'm worried about that because it's ambiguous of the way that it's stated. I think that answers the second aspect. Remind me of the third.
The second one was the data protection, like in our concept.
Oh yeah, So it's interesting. I don't think you were here yesterday, but one of the cases that we looked at yesterday was about fraud that had been committed by parliamentarians in abusing travel vouchers in the parliamentary travel system. And when an NGO that deals in public accountability wanted to publish or requested the annexure that had every MP and the amount that they had defrauded the travel scheme by, Parliament refused to give that information, saying, no, that's personal information. And the court said that's absolutely not personal information. This is about the members of Parliament's activities as a member of Parliament, and her defrauding of Parliament is a matter of state. And because it's a matter of state, therefore it's a matter for the public. And things like the asset register, for example, in Parliament, or of MPs and public officials generally, that information's public. That's not, if you want private information, get your own private job and don't be a public representative. But when you are a public representative getting paid on the public purse out of taxpayers' money, you have much less rights to your own private financial information. In South Africa, just because you weren't here yesterday, that extended to the press being given access to Jacob Zuma's tax records, which are usually the most privately kept.
I think, given some of the history of delayed implementation of other legislation, I think it might be nice to hear from Justine about the process from the act being passed in South Africa to it being implemented. And second part, maybe, what is the role that media and civil society might play in keeping that focus, on that implementation. in light of, and Dwight and I were talking at break time, that given government's limited resources and other positions in civil service not being filled, to look at this whole cadre of positions having to be filled and financed.
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that, and in fact, I was thinking about that in the break as well. What needs to happen to bring this into force? So the first thing is that there needs to be a staggered enactment of the legislation. So what needs to be brought into force first are the provisions around the appointment of the information regulator, the provisions around the staffing and the funding of the information regulator, and the provisions around, the information regulator and her or his deputy. We need to have that person in place first. Then we need to, and both of these can be done, all of this can be done at the same time. You can say we're providing for a staggered coming into force of the Act. That's normal. These sections establishing the information regulator are going to happen first, and they're going to happen next month. Then, the next provision is the ability to make regulations for the minister, and I would hope that the minister would, even though it's not expressly required in the Act, would consult with the information regulator about this, bring into being the regulations. Once those are there, the Act can be switched on straight away. It'll still take a while because people have got 2 years from the coming into force to develop their access to information manual and their lists of information that they can proactively put out. But at least the process of requesting access to information can start. And I think that can happen fairly quickly. I would think that you can enact the provisions around the information commissioner. Those could be enacted tomorrow. There's nothing that needs done other than the date. I would then give yourself 6 months or so for the enactment of the regulations by the minister and the appointment of the information commissioners, and then the whole Act can come into being. So it doesn't have to be a whole long drawn-out process. It will be a whole long drawn-out process if you leave it to government to do, and there isn't action from civil society, particularly NGOs and who need this, and the media.
My question was also surrounding or on the issue of how civil society within Namibia can be strengthened so that they can also push for the enactment of this law, and just how it can be taken seriously. Because you did mention in your presentations that South Africa, for example, its civil society space is one that really pushes and one that really puts in effort. So I really wanted to know, within the Namibian context, what can we do differently? Just, I believe 2 weeks ago, we had the Communication and Digital Rights Conference here in Windhoek, and a parliamentarian was in attendance, and they mentioned that there's perhaps a need for civil societies to involve these policymakers more often, rather than just have discussions around themselves. So is that maybe an effort that we can look into, or how can we go about it?
So I want to make 2 points following on from both of your questions. The first issue is that it can be disconcerting and even scary to put your head above the parapet to be a target for government if you're pushing very strongly for something. And that's why I think coalitions, particularly around legislation, are so important. It means speaking with a unified voice. It means strategizing what an appropriate time would be. I suggested 6 months, but I don't know how legal changes work in Namibia, if things work faster here because it's a smaller population and all of that, or does it go slower? People with intimate knowledge of the political scene in Namibia will be much better able to have those discussions. I think that the media should definitely be part of a coalition. I'm not necessarily sure that the media should lead it, but they must definitely be part of it, because they can constantly be publicizing and editorializing on the issue. I also think it's important to have it as mass-based as possible. So, and to cover all aspects, to be talking about the needs, for example, of the disability community, the needs of children in the education sector, the needs of organizations working in health, social development, economic justice, and the press, and importantly, the universities. Far too often, academics and academic departments are left out of coalitions. And the higher education, the universities are a massive resource for civil society and for the public, and they are too often left out of coalitions. So I think that they need to come together. Now, on the point that you raised about a member of parliament saying, oh, well, you should invite us and not just talk to us. Strategically, you need to meet amongst civil society first, because you've got to strategize, what do we want? And that really can, you know, what do we need government to do is a discussion that really shouldn't happen around government right in the very beginning. Once you've drawn up a proper program of action with suggestions, dates, and a program of action, I definitely think that you should involve government. I mean, one of the things that I'm so impressed by whenever I'm involved in issues, as I have been for the Action Coalition and for EFN, is that government does listen here, much more than in my experience. And they're willing to come to meetings and they're willing to engage. And I think that's hugely beneficial. But I wouldn't do that starting off where you're all around the table and you're debating and arguing about what needs to happen. There needs to be some level of coherence and solidification of your own campaign around this and demands around this. What I would say is that that needs to happen immediately. We're already nearly, I mean, we're mid-June now, so it's 6 months on, and no part of this act has been in place, and I'm not seeing draft regulations or anything that looks like it's going to be enacted. The longer you leave it, the less chance of it ever being brought into force. That's why it's so critical to do it now.
Yeah, I think, as civil societies that we really need to, strengthen our relationships. It was encouraging to hear from Justine how South Africa is doing. So perhaps we can learn a lot from them also. At the end of the day, all the NGOs, in Namibia, we are working for the same cause. It's, to the advancements of the community members, the, people on the grassroots level. And we are the ones actually, being the voice for the voiceless. Yeah. So it's really an area that needs ASP attention.
I love that phrase, voice of the voiceless. Try and find a way of including that in the coalition materials around this. Because the point about having a voice is about expressing yourself. And the right to freedom of expression is made up of two parts. The right to impart information, to vocalize your concerns, but it's also about the right to receive information and ideas. And people are voiceless without information because they're not informed then about what they're saying, and nonsense comes out if you don't have information. And I love that slogan because actually, even though it's focused on the voice, that's one half of the equation around freedom of expression and active citizenship. The other is having access to credible, accessible, accurate information, which is what this act is about. I just want to say two things. If you have the resources and can get the funding for it, one of the things that I would suggest is that you develop a draft set of regulations yourself, at least the outlines, because it's much easier for the ministry to take an existing set and say, actually, there's some very good ideas in here. I might change this, I might change that, but at least they're working off a draft. And, you know, you can feel free to use South African precedents that they're going to obviously need to change because of your own act, and look for funding to pay people that can draft that for you. It makes such a difference to be able to go to government and say, here's a draft. I can't tell you how often we've done that as civil society, and then you see your wording in regulations and in Parliament. It's really critical.
If in any context that I've thought about in Namibian context, that there is no like punitive reactions towards an outlet that potentially reports on the personal banking, personal financials of a minister, which is not disclosed to the Parliament platform, where the thing about the assets that I spoke of, and which actively you sit with this conundrum, because as a media professional you sit with what is information that literally qualifies the public, qualifies B2B in public, and what doesn't qualify. But in both cases you've already answered that, Justine, in terms of, listen, if the person contests to be in public, then yes, they have to realize that certain components of their life is going to be public. And if the person deals with information in a public sphere and is part of a public process, that ultimately any process qualifies as public. So yeah.
I want to expand on that, actually, because in South Africa, for example, there's been the big collapse of the Steinhoff Group, which was a big high flyer on our stock exchange. And the Access to Information Act has been used to get a lot of financial information, transactional information from the banks about this transaction, about these transactions. And the way that they're doing it is by saying, you're a publicly listed company. People publicly invested in you. You defrauded the public who invested in you. And it comes back to that age-old press conundrum that what is in the public interest does not necessarily mean what is interesting to the public. Yeah. So the financial records, for example, of, I don't know, a rapper, yeah, or an actress or a celeb might be fascinating, but that's not in the public interest. Unless, there was fraud, or do you know what I mean? Unless that person held themselves out to be something that they're not. So that's always where the tension is. Prove disclosure in the public interest, and you should be fine.
The point that I wanted to raise was on the issue of imparting knowledge and information. In the context of Namibia, for example, our literacy level on one is not really the highest. So I think when it comes to the part of really passing this law and getting the public to understand what it means to them on a personal level, how they can use it, it would be advantageous if we can also look into translating into the local language. Our country is made up of huge groups. that speak different languages. So for people to make sense of this information and how they can also use it to their advantages in their different sectors, it would be good if we can look at translating into different languages so they can also just really understand how they can use them on a daily, and to also just crack down what needs to be cracked down.
I think that's a critical role for civil society as well, to push for the Act, the regulations, and the Information Commissioner's plain language guide to be made available in all languages.
Also, just in addition, for the hearing impaired, also, for them also to be, a provision for them also to be inclusive sign language. So, inclusivity, it's key also in this document. So, so there's quite a lot of things that needs to be added into it for each and everyone to understand, and also the media, playing the important role also. The radios, the different stations, Oshiwambo, Afrikaans, the languages, all the languages being covered.
My biggest concern that which Justine also pointed out with regards to getting the ball rolling technically, getting the game in action. Because what I've regularly observed and viewing how slow processes take when it comes to acts and laws being enacted is if we point towards civil society or the media or everyone, all the stakeholders, including government, getting together and say, listen guys, let's start appointing people and get things going. Why has it always been a situation, and it's not an entirely just a question for you, Justine, but if we look at lawmaking, why has it always been such a tedious, slow process? Is there a motivation of potentially which ruling party is in power? Ultimately, because that's what both Namibia and South Africa's political participation looks at, and then you can identify which interests usually are present there, or has it been just ultimately a human aspect of pure feet dragging, just being completely slow in the process?
So lawmaking is slow. It's painful. It's contested because it's between political parties and between what happens in Parliament and civil society. There's a lot of contestation. It's also slowed when it is something that government is doing for the good of the people, but can boomerang on them. And access to information legislation, like whistleblower protection, is legislation that can boomerang on governments, like establishing an ombud, like establishing a human rights commission. These are things that governments are understandably, I think, wary of. What I think, this is my own personal view, and it might be wrong, but there are, just over 2 million people in Namibia. There are 9 million people just in Joburg, and I feel like it's a village and that I know everyone in town. I imagine that it's difficult to walk down the street and you don't know every person who's walking past you practically. When you operate at an elite level, and let's make no mistake, everyone around this table is in the 1%. Everyone around this table is educated and has access to communications and information that is not available if you are desperately poor without access to data or education. The point I'm making is that the elite, whether that's in the media, whether that's the media, civil society, or government, you probably all know each other. Like, it's an even smaller group than among the 2 million, right? Now we're talking a few tens of thousands of people max. And at the level above that, at the level of ministers and directors with heads of NGOs and editors, you really know people and the actual relationships there. Relationships that, if damaged, can have serious consequences for everyone. And when you're operating in a small pond like that, no one wants to stick their head above the parapet. And that's why, and you see it in a number of areas, Namibia is not a litigious country. People don't rush to court to hold public power accountable. And one of the things that I think is really important is that when you have a look at what is the basic role of the judicial branch of government, the basic role is to interpret the law. So Parliament passes the law, government develops the policy, Parliament passes the law, the judges say, this is what the law means. Taking a government department to court does not mean I want to punish you, I hate you, I'm against you. It means we need to go, because we have different views on what this act means and what should happen, we need to go and get an interpretation of the law from the judge. And it helps everyone. It helps government, it helps civil society, it helps the media. Most importantly, it helps people. Now, the problem is that no one wants to be the name on the litigation. So let me tell you the very best way. Let's call it the People's Coalition or the Voice of the People. I really liked that. Get a name, make it as broad as possible. Include the media, include academics, include civil society, and that is the organization that goes and gets, not challenges, gets the interpretation of the law to set the parameters. Then no one's head is above the parapet. There really is, in civil society, there is strength in unity, where an injury to one, that old slogan, injury to one is an injury to all. If you work together, you can achieve much more. And if you're able to pool meager resources together in a coalition, then you're able to afford the kind of assistance that will help you be successful. And remember, every successful, I don't know if it's the case in South Africa, but just every successful litigation, you get the costs. So you're able then to say to lawyers who are doing it on risk, you will get your money in the end. And in South Africa, I don't know if they do it here, but our constitutional court has said where civil society has engaged in litigation to clarify the parameters of a constitutional right, even if they are not successful, we won't get them to pay the other party's costs. You pay your own costs, even if you lose, but you don't then have to, you're not saddled with government's huge bill.
My name is Wakutura Kambaikwa. I'm representing the Kunene Community Radio station that we started in 2017 per se from the Kunene region. I must say that the ATI bill, which has been now long overdue, it's going to be massive. It's going to be helpful because we know that in the region it has been now very difficult in order to get news from various government agencies, officials from local authorities and so forth. The bill, I think it's going to be very helpful in that very same regard, because you come and look at your office and at times they will say that we can't give you this, we can't provide this confidential and so forth. But I understand that this bill, should it be enacted, I think it's going to be very helpful, not just to journalists or community reporters, but I think to everyone out there who also need access to this information or this much needed information for the public view.
The new act, access to information, it's going to be helpful in the sense that the people of Namibia, they are now going to use it to be able to have access to information of public interest. When it comes to the media, yes, we have our own procedures of journalism, how to get a story, for example. Like we had, is that it's not going to necessarily replace the rules of being a professional in journalism, but is going to complement the existing ways of getting information.
I just wanted to reflect on what has been a very, very empowering and very stimulating training on this access to information law. It has been very, very beautiful because so much information that we thought we knew actually emerged. For example, there are loose ends in this law that we as the media, as Namibians, as civil society must seek to rectify.
My name is Simon Liseli, a journalist for Caprivi Vision newspaper, a newspaper based in the Zambezi region, but it covers the whole country, Africa and the world at large. I come for this training workshop for access to information for journalists. So in this workshop, I captured some knowledges that will help me to change in my reporting. And indeed, I appreciate the organizers and the facilitators of this workshop. I thank you.